Now is Joey Jackson. He's a criminal defense attorney and CNN legal analyst. And Sergeant DeAndre Hutchison, he's with the Houston Police Department. He's also president of the African American Police Officers League. Thanks to both of you. Cedric, let me call you Sergeant. DeAndre, let me call you Sergeant. I won't take your rank away from you. As you watch that video of George Floyd, both the method that the police officer, the physical method he is using to restrain George Floyd, knee on his neck for several minutes, but also the officers, his colleagues, standing back and watching it. What are officers taught to do? What are they not taught to do in their training? And what did you see violated there beyond the obvious? What did you see, more than one thing, I imagine, violated there as a fellow police officer?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of things violated, and we're trained here in the Houston Police Department that when the cuffs go on, the fighting stops, and that situation is under control. So to see that man in cuffs, to see nobody checking on his well-being, it seemed very, very inhumane. And witnesses crying out like he's not breathing. He's check on his breathing, check for a pulse. And to no avail. So it was very, very disturbing to watch that video of George Floyd. And, and like I say, the human part of it was ignored tremendously. And that how could another human being hear somebody say, I can't breathe? And had that been that officer's mother, brother, or a sister, or dog for that matter, he would have checked his breathing. Or their breathing. Yeah. So to that part of it, that's not what we're trained to do, and I don't know why that was allowed to take place in Minnesota.
Yeah, Poppy. I mean, it's not the first time we've heard that phrase "dehumanizing" used from fellow police officers, right? We've heard that, and that really strikes you.
You're right, Jim. Including the St. Paul police chief to us yesterday, right? Joey, why have these officers not been charged or arrested?
That's a great question. Good morning, Poppy. Good morning, Jim. So let's start here. The fact of the matter is, what did we see this morning? We saw our colleague, Omar Jimenez, be arrested for nothing, right, in the broad daylight. And the fact is he's doing nothing but his job. We heard him being respectful. We heard him doing everything he could do to comply. But yet he's put under arrest for what? How many times has that happened where it's not on camera, and then we question the narrative of the person about you must have been doing something wrong? He wasn't. So why do I say that before I get to your question? If he can be arrested, that is Omar, for doing nothing, why wouldn't the officers be arrested here? Now, let me tell you what concerns me. What concerns me is you don't have to wait to get every single bit of information that you need in order to establish someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not how our system works. I practice in state court and federal work, and here's how it works. If you have probable cause to believe, reason to believe that a crime occurred, you make the arrest. You charge someone as it relates to what you saw. Thereafter, if you want to amend the charges, modify the charges, upgrade the charges, you're allowed to do that. But what we heard at the press conference was very disappointing, and it's very concerning when you think about what we saw and you think about what was said. And so I can't answer that question, Poppy. I understand due process greatly. I think everyone should be afforded due process, but I don't believe my eyes were lying when I saw what I saw, and I do believe that arrests should have been forthcoming and should have happened already.
Sergeant Hutchison, we talked about how officers are trained in terms of arresting and using violence, right? What they're trained to do, not to do, and so on. How about that arrest of a journalist doing his job? And we should note our colleague was later released, but the state police of Minnesota, they have not apologized. They claim that they were just confirming he was a member of the press, though he repeatedly identified himself as so and was live on the air, we should note. What are officers like those under your command trained to do regarding journalists who are covering news as it happens?
Like I say, I apologize for my manners. Good morning, Jim and Poppy. Thank you for having me on. But before I answer that question, and it's yet another incident where it looks like those officers were just overreacting for whatever reason, we know that race could play a part in that, but they were overreacting. But I'm going to say because the tensions were high in the area that, there may be some legitimacy to what they did. But we have a policy here at the Houston Police Department that allows media, and we normally set up a staging area for media on very controlled scenes. But when a journalist is starting to interfere with public duties, like I say, I'm not very familiar with what the goal of those police officers were, what was going on in that intersection, and that type of thing. But if they're interfering with the mission of whatever they're trying to complete, then there's possibility. But they should have never arrested, like you say. That I don't believe that probable cause statute that he just mentioned was satisfied. They didn't have enough probable cause to say that journalist not just, in fact, doing his job. So I don't think that arrest.
Just for clarity, Sergeant, because I know it's early in the morning and you may not have seen the full video, but 4 minutes ahead of his arrest, not only does Omar hold up his credential, and the producer said he's with CNN on live TV, he repeatedly asked the officers, I'll go wherever you want. Where do you want me to move? It's up to you. Just tell me. And I think that's so important here. For these 4 officers and the death, Joey, of George Floyd, for officers Chauvin, who had his knee on his neck, and for Officer Thao, who stood there and watched, and the other officers, Officers Kung and Officer Lane, what about those who didn't have their knee but didn't do anything to stop it when he was begging for air? What would they be charged with?
I think then, Poppy, you're complicit with it. The fact of the matter is you have a duty and an obligation if you're there. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of a problem. You have the ability as an officer to stop a fellow officer and you see a crime in progress. That crime is not being engaged in by a member of public. It's being engaged in by a person who wears a badge. It's being engaged in what I believe and what I see to be very willful. We see a person who clearly is in distress, who's saying he can't breathe. You have other bystanders pleading not only with that officer, Poppy, but the officer with respect to the one that had his knee on his neck, but with the others. Do you see what he's doing? Can you stop it? They do nothing. That's official misconduct, and certainly worse than that as it relates to, are you that complicit that you should be charged with the crime that he is? And so the fact of the matter is that firing clearly is not enough. There's reason to believe that a crime was occurred by the other officers there, and I am not sure at all why the trigger shouldn't have been pulled as it relates to an arrest in this case.
We'll be watching closely. Listen, Joey Jackson. Sorry, Sergeant Hutchison. Final thought.
And that's absolutely correct. Those officers are just as guilty, and that needs to be the resounding thing to stop this violence. That needs to be the theme that goes across the country, that if you stand by and you do nothing on a scene where you know that an officer is doing or using excessive force, you are just as guilty. Our public deserves better, and we've violated that trust, and we need to do a lot of work to build it back up.
Powerful words from a fellow police officer. Sergeant Hutchison, we appreciate what you do and your insight here. Joey Jackson as well.